In the last lecture, we looked at the education system that Plato proposes for everyone in Callipolis, the ideal city. And we saw that it was supposed to have particular kinds of psychological effects on people, ensuring that they weren't too extreme in one respect and too deficient in another, but ensuring that they had balanced and well-rounded characters. Now, Book 4 is really important because it further develops this idea, explaining how it is that the education system and the arrangement in Callipolis enables people to become virtuous, namely, how it enables them to have the individual virtues: courage, wisdom, justice, and moderation. So the reason that Book 4 is a really important book in the Republic is not only does it explain kind of this fundamental question of how it is that education and our political arrangements can help us to become good people, but it's also supposed to provide a preliminary answer to the question, why be just at all? The reason is that Plato's giving us an account of what justice is, and at the end of Book 4, we're supposed to start to see already why it is that justice might be appealing. Now the catch is, the account of justice that Plato gives in Book 4 is kind of strange, and lots of people have wondered why think that this is justice at all. So let's dig into the text, and what we'll do is we'll work through each of the individual virtues, and then we'll explain at the end why it is that I think Book 4 gives an answer to this question of why be just. First, let's get clear again on the method that Plato is using in this part of the Republic. We looked to the city because the city was supposed to have justice in it more clearly, or more of it, or bigger. So the point was supposed to be, once we identify each of the virtues in the city, we're then going to be able to more easily identify them in the soul. In that sense, the arrangement of the ideal city is supposed to be an analogy for the good soul. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to work through and identify each of the virtues in the city, and then think about what their parallel in the soul might be. And we're going to get an important claim, which is that justice is going to end up being the same thing in the city as in the soul. Callipolis has a specialist class of people who are trained to be the rulers. Now, more spoilers, we're going to find out in the next book that these people actually end up being philosophers, hence the famous point about the Republic being a city of philosopher rulers. But at this stage, we haven't quite got to that point. What we do know, though, is that there is a specialist class of rulers. And what Socrates asks is, well, in virtue of what are they able to be good rulers and do their job? And he says that the city is wise because these people have good judgment, namely that they have a kind of knowledge about the city as a whole and the maintenance of good relations both internally and with other cities. So the city is said to be wise when a particular class, the ruling class, has a kind of knowledge. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that Plato's saying straight away that we should just put academics in government? I don't think that's quite right. Especially at this stage of the dialogue, I think all he's getting at is the idea that the people who have the job of governing have knowledge in governing. Namely, they're competent. They know what they're talking about. They understand how the system works. They understand what's effective political policy. And they're able to explain to other people why it is that the decision that they made is the correct one. In that sense, they're skilled in the same way that a doctor is skilled. So if you were to ask a doctor, why did you prescribe this particular drug for this particular illness, they'll be able to give you a rational response, and it will be a response that's grounded in knowledge. At this stage, that's what's really important for the rulers to have in the city. They're wise insofar as they can exercise good judgment and back it up with a kind of rational account. In this case, it's pretty easy to see what the parallel in the soul is. Just as the rulers of a city make decisions on behalf of the city, they exercise judgments about what should be done, and they work out what will be good arrangements and good ways for the city to go about its life. In the same way, we have a rational part of our soul. And the rational part of our soul also has the job of governing our own lives. We have to make decisions about how to live our life. We have to make judgments about what's good and what's bad for us. And we have to find ways to maintain good relationships with other people and maintain what we'll find out is going to be a good relationship within ourselves, within the parts of our soul. Plato's preferred way of explaining why it is that we call this wisdom and how it's connected with rationality in particular is he thinks that the basis for making good decisions and for living a good life, for making good judgments about how we should go forward in our life, ultimately is going to depend on how much knowledge we have of the world and how much knowledge we have of goodness. So ethics, the study of basically what makes things good and what makes life go well, is going to end up being really important for explaining why it is that particular people have wisdom. They are grounded in the truth. They're grounded in knowledge about what it is that makes a human life go well. And because the rational part of their soul, ideally, is going to be in charge of making these decisions, the rational part of the soul, in its good condition, is what's going to be responsible for our living a good life. One of the really key insights of Platonic philosophy is that it doesn't matter how much wisdom you have yourself or how much good advice you get from other people, if you don't have the fortitude, if you don't have the endurance, and you don't have the self-discipline to follow through on that advice. In that sense, the next two virtues we're going to look at, courage and moderation, really focus on how it is that a person is able to ensure that the good advice that comes from the ruling class and the rational part of the soul is actually effective in action. It actually follows through such that you end up living in accordance with it. So let's look at the definition of courage that Plato gives, and then we'll see how it is that this idea kind of plays out once we think through the definition. He says that the city is courageous because of a part of itself that has the power to preserve through everything its belief about what things are to be feared, namely that they're the things and kinds of things that the lawgiver declared to be such in the course of educating it. Okay, so what does that mean? Now, think back to the education system. One of the crucial parts of this is that the citizens were told correct stories about which kinds of things are shameful, which kinds of things are good, and they had good role models to look up to, who we presumably think would be afraid of the right things, take caution with respect to the right things, but also know which things are worth fighting for and which things are worth standing up for. Now, the city is said to be courageous when the auxiliaries, the ones who went through this education process and were taught these things, are able to preserve those beliefs that they were taught in education in the earlier years, basically when push comes to shove. So it's really easy to think about this in a military context. The citizens are taught that it's appropriate to fight for the defense of their country. And obviously, when you're in battle, especially in ancient Greece, where if you're a hoplite, there are people coming at you with swords and they want to stab you, it's scary and it's going to hurt. So there's all of this fear that you have to deal with. You might die. And obviously, there's a physical pain that you have to endure. Now, the citizens are said to be courageous insofar as in those kinds of moments, they're able to remember the lessons. They're able to remember that pain is not necessarily an evil, and they're able to remember that the city is worth fighting for, that there are values worth fighting for that go beyond their own self-preservation and that go beyond their own concerns. So the courage manifests insofar as they're able to hold true to their values. They're able to hold true to what they've been taught, even in situations when it looks like it would be really easy to compromise on those values. It's gonna hurt way less if you just run away. But that's not what soldiers need to do. Soldiers need to stand firm. And in that sense, what they're doing is they have the power to preserve through everything the beliefs that they were taught in education. So what's the parallel for the individual soul then? Presumably most of you aren't going to be going out in hoplite armor and fighting other Greek cities, but it's also the case that you have values that you know that you should stick to, but sometimes it's really tempting not to. So let's say you're at work and you know that your company has particular policies that are supposed to promote diversity and be environmentally conscious. Now, of course, most companies have their primary goal as making money. So let's say that in the meeting, your boss tries to slip through a motion that you know is really aimed to save money, but that it's going to have really bad consequences in terms of the department culture, or maybe it'll actually have some pretty nasty environmental effects? Do you stand up in the meeting and raise your voice and say, look, we agreed that we weren't going to do this kind of thing. I know that it would be easier for us not to, but we really need to do this here. Now, it's scary to do that, and you could get into trouble. This could be the kind of thing that, later on, if you've annoyed your boss, it could potentially cost you a promotion or something like that. But the point is, if you're sticking to your values despite temptations not to, you're showing a kind of courage. And so in the same way that the soldiers of the city are able to preserve their values from education about what's to be feared and what's not to be feared, in the same way, courage is for you a matter of preserving the values that you have and sticking to those. In that sense, I think it's really easy to see courage in the Republic as very close to what we would call integrity. It's the ability to stick to your values, to stick to what you've been taught and what you think is right, even when it's really tempting not to. Now, just as courage is primarily found in the auxiliaries in the city, it's primarily found in our thumos, the spirited part of our soul. And this isn't actually obvious, but it's giving us more indication as to what Plato thinks the spirited part of our soul actually does. Now again, the situation is you know what's right, but you have to kind of muster the emotional resources. You have to kind of psych yourself up in order to stand firm to what you believe in. In that sense, what Plato's recommending is that we kind of recruit our emotional resources, especially the emotional resources that deal with how we manage with other people. And we use those in order to generate action. So we have the right judgment about what we need to do, but we need to muster the emotional energies, we need to muster the kind of spirited resources that we have in order to stick through to that course of action. To give a really clear example, two of the spirited emotions that Plato mentions are anger and shame. And in both cases, it's easy to see how you could recruit anger and shame in order to get people to stick to their values. On the one hand, you can get angry at other people when they've made a commitment and then they're reneging on it or they're breaking that commitment. So if your boss made a commitment to care for the environment and then they're not, Plato thinks that you should get angry at them. On the other hand, if you're the kind of person who's made a particular commitment and you think about breaking that because it would be easier, he thinks that you should muster your emotional resources of shame. You should feel bad that you've done that. And you should think about how it is that other people will see you, knowing that you've made some commitment, for example, to vegetarianism, and then they catch you eating meat. So in both cases, anger and shame are supposed to help motivate us to stick to the values that we have and to encourage other people to stick to the values that we've agreed on. This word, moderation, causes me no end of troubles, in part because there's just no good English equivalent. That being said, I actually think it's pretty easy to get into what these people are thinking about. Moderation is the virtue that is normally concerned with controlling your pleasures. It's someone who is rightly disposed with respect to their pleasures, especially their bodily pleasures, such that they're able to control themselves. So in that sense, moderation is really closely linked to self-control, but is also slightly different. The moderate person is the person whose pleasures are kind of in accordance with reason. Now, again, what does all this mean? I think the easiest way to really get into what the Greeks are thinking about with respect to moderation is just to consider someone who isn't moderate. So think about someone who can't control themselves around alcohol. Basically, I think we'd call them messy. I wish there were a better way of describing it. It's the kind of person who, they just, whenever you go out drinking with them, they can't handle themselves. They drink too much, they act inappropriately, they don't know what their limits are. In that sense, they in a sense enjoy alcohol too much, but it also ends up causing them more pain afterwards. Again, they're just kind of messy. The moderate person is the opposite of that. This is the person who's able to enjoy food and drink, and they go out with their friends and have a good time. They don't eat too much, and they drink the appropriate amount. So their pleasures are in accordance with reason. They don't do anything they regret the next morning. And so they're moderate in the sense that their pleasures are in accordance with reason. Now, what Socrates says is that the city is moderate when the desires of the inferior many are controlled by the wisdom and desires of the superior few. And he later glosses it in saying, the ruler and the ruled share the same belief about who should rule. Moderation in the ideal city then involves the whole city. It involves both the lower classes and the ruling class, and is a kind of harmony or agreement between those classes. The idea here is that the city is arranged in accordance with people's particular skills and competencies, but there's always a temptation for just anybody to kind of give their opinion, even when they're not qualified to do so. So in the case that Plato has in mind, the desires of what he calls the inferior people, so basically the people in the lower classes, the craftspeople, they're going to want to give their opinions on how the city should be run. For example, they might think that it's unfair that they don't get to have a say in government. But the point is supposed to be that the reason that they don't get a say in government is that they're better fitted to do something else, namely to stick to their particular crafts. And they haven't had the training and they don't have the knowledge that's going to enable them to participate in government. So when there's a disharmony between the citizens, it's because they don't agree on who should be ruling and what kind of direction the city should go in. But he says that there's moderation when it is that the lower classes agree that the arrangements are currently best for them, and they agree that the people who have had the training and experience at ruling should be the ones who rule. Again, just as there are different classes of people in the ideal city, there are different parts of our soul. And in the case of moderation in the soul, what it primarily concerns is the control of our bodily pleasures that come from our appetites. And we're going to have a moderate person when the person's appetites, when the bodily pleasures, agree that what's best is for reason to decide how to go forward. Now, this is actually, I think, easier to see in the soul than it is in the city, despite what Plato says. And the reason that it works is because of this. There are often situations where we think, man, it would just feel way better if I just broke my diet for this week, or I just gave up on my training regime. It would feel way better. Now, what Plato thinks is going on in this situation is that the appetites are trying to take control of the soul. Namely, the appetites who think that pleasure is the good, that bodily pleasure is the good, and that bodily pain is bad. Sometimes it's going to want to take over what we might call our considered judgment about what we should do. So again, in a cool, calm moment in the morning, you think, well, yeah, I mean, obviously I should go to the gym today. Obviously I should stick to my diet. But at the end of the day, when you're tired and you're sore already, and you think, man, I don't want to go to the gym and I really don't want to have more chicken, it's the appetites that want to take over. Now, of course, we call that temptation, but how Plato explains that is the desires of the appetitive part of the soul are trying to take over what reason has prescribed that's good for us as a whole. So again, we see this idea of self-discipline coming through, that what we need to do is rouse the spirited part of our soul to kind of hold appetite in its place and ensure that the judgments of reason can result in action for us. And Plato thinks a crucial part of that process is keeping the appetite small and well regulated, so that we don't constantly give in to bodily pleasures. If we do, he thinks it's going to be really easy for the bodily pleasures to take over, for the appetitive part of the soul to take over governance, and this is what happens when you don't have moderation. So what moderation in the soul does is ensure that there's a harmony between all of the parts, that they all agree that we're going to stick to what reason prescribes, we're going to stick to our considered judgments about what's best, rather than go in for what feels good at the moment, but in fact is going to be bad for us overall. Having explained the other three virtues, Socrates then turns to the question of what justice is. And he says that justice is each citizen doing their own work and not meddling with what isn't their own. Now, what we can see is that justice then ends up being based on the principle of specialization that we saw way back in Book 2. Each class of the city has a particular function, and when it performs that function well, and they're not prevented from performing that function, and they don't meddle in other people's functions, that city is just. In that sense, justice in the city is a kind of good order. and it's when each part performs the function that it's supposed to have. The same account then is also going to work for the soul. Socrates says that justice in the soul is each part of the soul doing its own work, namely performing the function that it's supposed to perform. And because, as there are three classes of city, there are three parts of the soul: reason, spirit, and appetite. Each of them is going to be doing what it's supposed to do when it's acting excellently in accordance with its function. So the function of reason is to be in accordance with truth and knowledge and to exercise good judgment. The function of spirit is to function excellently with respect to our social relations and maintain internal harmony and protect us from external threats. And the function of appetite is to maintain the bodily constitution, mainly to ensure that we continue living at this kind of basic animal level. An unjust soul, then, is going to be one in which the functions of the soul, the parts of the soul, end up getting all messed up. Namely, parts of the soul that are supposed to perform one function end up trying to perform one of the functions of the other parts of the soul. There have been a truly ridiculous number of articles written on this question about Plato's conception of justice in the Republic. So of course, I'm just going to give you my take on this, recognizing that there's a lot more that could be said. Now, the first thing I think to get clear on is actually what the conception of justice is. Again, a huge number of people say that Plato's account of justice in the Republic is that justice is a kind of psychic harmony. But if you were paying attention, you would have noticed that the psychic harmony is actually the account of moderation. The account of justice is each part of the soul and each citizen doing its own work. So for your papers, don't say that justice is psychic harmony. It's not. Psychic harmony is moderation. Justice is each part of the soul doing its own work. Okay, but how is doing your own work justice? What's the connection there? Why should we even think this is a good conception of justice? Well, I think the key is to think back to what it's based on, the principle of specialization. And so again, if you pay close attention in the lecture about Book 2, the principle of specialization was supposed to establish three things about how roles are allocated in the city. People have their roles because they have a nature which is fitted for that task, they have the training for that task, and they have the knowledge and the competence in order to perform that task well. An unjust city, then, is going to be a city where the roles are assigned to people who don't have natures fitted for them, who haven't had the training in order to perform them well, and who don't have the knowledge or the competence in order to do a good job at them. So think about this in terms of the auxiliaries, who are supposed to be both soldiers and police officers. If they haven't had sufficient training, they're not going to be able to do their job well as soldiers. They're not going to be able to stand firm in battle. They're not going to be able to show courage when they should. And on the other hand, they're also supposed to be gentle in their role as police officers. They're supposed to be gentle and friendly towards the citizens. So the auxiliaries, if they were harsh towards the citizens, it shows that they don't have a sufficiently gentle nature in that respect, and thus aren't going to do a good job at what they're supposed to. And while I think it's easy to see this in kind of a totalitarian light, where what Plato is saying is each person should be in their proper place, think about this more positively. The thought is supposed to be everybody has the job that they deserve, and everybody has the job that they're fitted for and have the training for. So everybody in Plato's Republic enjoys the work that they do, and they're good at it. That's why it is that he says that happiness is able to be spread through the city as a whole. Each person really enjoys their work, and because they have the training and the competence to do it well, all of the results from all of the classes are as good as they could be. So think about the justice in terms of people having the jobs that they deserve. If you're the kind of person who really is fitted for learning and is fitted to be a ruler, then that's the position that you'll have in Plato's Republic. If you don't make it through the gymnastic and musical training because you'd rather be doing something else, you'd rather just be keeping to yourself, working at your 9-to-5 job, then that's what you'll have. So it's not like Plato is forcing people to do things against their will, or that he's systematically oppressing different classes of people. It's rather that you're put into the class that most suits your nature and that you have the training for. So I think you can see the connection between each class doing its own work and justice if you think about what people deserve and what they're fitted to do. Once you start thinking about justice in the city as each part performing its proper function, I think it's much easier to see why you should care about having a just soul. Plato's account of justice is, in this sense, grounded in human nature. It's grounded in human psychology. He's identified particular parts of our soul, particular parts of how the human psyche functions, and then asks, well, what would be the good condition of each of these things? What's the best state for our soul to be in? And it turns out that actually things go badly when, for example, the appetites take over, or the spirited part of our soul isn't properly trained. Things go best when our considered judgments about goodness are able to shape our lives, when we have the self-discipline to hold true to our values, the integrity to stick to our values even when it's hard. In that sense, I think it's much easier to see why you should care about being just on Plato's account once you think about it in terms of function. And there's a crucial analogy at the end of Book 4 between what we might call psychic health and bodily health. Plato says there are just objective facts about what it is for a body to be healthy. There are facts about what it is for your eyes to function in the way that they should, and there are facts about what it is for your body to be in a healthy state and not diseased. In the same way, he thinks there are facts about psychic health. There are features about us that are just functioning well or functioning badly. For example, the appetites are functioning badly when our desires for bodily pleasure are overwhelming our desires about what we actually think is best for our life as a whole. So what we see then is an objective account of both bodily health and psychic health. And once you see that justice is a kind of psychic health, you'll see why it's choice-worthy and why you should want to be just. Now, you'll notice this is only the end of Book 4 and there are still 6 books to go. So Plato's going to say more about why we should care about justice, but at least at this stage, using the argument from the functions of the different parts of our soul, I hope it's clear why there's kind of a preliminary answer to this question at the end of Book 4.